My one 9-year-old daughter married a 6-year-old man with no future. I warned her it was a mistake. She uninvited me from her wedding. But when her life collapsed and she came back begging for help, my answer left them speechless. I'm 42 years old. I run a creative agency that I built from scratch, and I need to tell this story because what happened with my daughter, Natalie, basically broke my heart in a way I never thought possible. You know, as a father, you always want to protect your kids, but there comes a point where you have to ask yourself if you're helping or just prolonging the inevitable. I guess I should start at the beginning, when everything went to shit, which was like 7 years ago when my marriage to Catherine exploded. Natalie was 12 when Catherine and I got divorced, and honestly, it was a disaster. I'm not going to get into all the details because that would be a whole other story, but basically Catherine met someone else and decided she wanted a new life. What really screwed Natalie up was how fast everything happened. Catherine remarried like 6 months after the divorce, and like a year later, she already had a new baby, and then another, and another. Within 3 years, my ex-wife had 3 more kids with her new husband, and Natalie basically went from being an only child to being the forgotten older daughter in this perfect new family that Catherine built. Look, I understand that Catherine had the right to rebuild her life. You know what I mean? But what I could never forgive her for was how she emotionally abandoned Natalie in the process. Visits became increasingly spaced out. There was always some excuse. The baby was sick, they had family plans. Whatever. Natalie started coming to my house after spending the weekend with her mother, and I noticed her getting quieter each time. Sadder. It broke my heart to see her like that. It really did. I threw myself completely into being the best possible father for her. I started taking on more projects at the agency so I could give her everything she needed, but also to be present. You know, because working from home allowed me to be there when she got home from school. I'd take her to the movies, out to eat, tried to do activities with her on weekends. I basically became her everything. And looking back, I was probably too protective. My mother, Beatrice, a woman in her 70s who doesn't mince words, told me several times she'd say I was overprotecting her, that I needed to let her grow. But I just saw my little girl suffering, and I wanted to fix it. Things got really bad when Natalie was 15. She just stopped going to school. It wasn't gradual. One day, she literally refused to get out of bed. She'd tell me she didn't see the point, that she hated school, that she had no friends, that everything seemed like shit to her. I tried everything. Honestly, I took Natalie to therapy, talked to her teachers, tried to understand what was happening. The therapist told me Natalie was depressed, that the divorce and the situation with her mother had done more damage than I thought. So I decided to give her space, let her take some time, thinking it would only be a few months. Those months turned into 2 years. 2. A full years where Natalie basically did nothing productive. She spent all her time in her room, on social media, sleeping late, watching shows. I kept working like crazy to support her, paid for therapy that she half attended, tried to motivate her. Nothing worked. I called Catherine more times than I can count, asking her to talk to Natalie, to help her. Catherine always said she would, but never did. She was always busy with her young kids. Even my mother tried to talk to Natalie, sit with her and make her see reason, but Natalie just withdrew more. Finally, I don't know what happened exactly, but when Natalie was 17, she kind of woke up one day and decided to go back to school. I was euphoric, like I thought things were finally going to get better. And at first it seemed like they were. Natalie went back to high school, started leaving the house, seemed a bit more upbeat. I relaxed a little, thought we'd gotten through the worst of it. How wrong I was. 6 months after she went back to school, Natalie met Derek. Derek was a 26-year-old guy who did deliveries for his parents' bakery. Yeah, you read that right, 26 years old. When I found out his age, I was furious. I mean, my daughter was barely 18, technically of legal age, but basically still a kid, and this guy was almost 27. But Natalie swore to me he was different, that Derek understood her, that he'd been through difficult things too because he never finished high school and had gotten divorced a couple years back. Yeah, he'd already been married before. All the red flags were there, literally waving in front of my face. The first few months I tried to be understanding, you know, I didn't want to push Natalie away by being the controlling father. I let her bring Derek to the house, tried to get to know him, be nice. And honestly, Derek wasn't necessarily a bad guy, but it was obvious he had no ambition, no plans, nothing. He worked for his parents, making minimum wage, lived in a small apartment he shared with a roommate. His car was a mess. I saw all this and thought, okay, well, maybe in time he'll mature, maybe Natalie needs this to feel loved. But then, like 4 months after they started dating, Natalie came home super excited and dropped the bomb on me. She said, "Dad, I have something to tell you. Derek proposed to me, and I said yes. We're getting married in 3 months." I froze. Literally couldn't process what I'd just heard. I said, "Natalie, you're 19 years old. You haven't even finished school yet. What are you talking about?" And she told me she'd already decided that Derek was the love of her life, that she'd finally found someone who made her happy. I tried to reason with her. I really tried. I told her that marriage wasn't something you rush into, that she barely knew Derek, that they needed time to be sure. I asked her how they were going to support themselves, where they were going to live, how they were going to pay the bills. Natalie told me they already had it all planned. Out. That they were going to get an apartment together. That Derek was going to ask for a raise at the bakery. That I was being negative and didn't support her. I reminded her that Derek didn't even have a high school education, that he made minimum wage, that she herself had no job and hadn't finished school. Nothing, I said, mattered to her. So I told her I wanted to sit down with Derek and talk to him face to face. That conversation was probably one of the most frustrating of my life. Derek came to the house on a Saturday afternoon, and I tried to stay calm, to be reasonable. I asked him what his long-term plans were, how he planned to support Natalie, if he'd considered going back to school. His answers were vague, like he'd say things like, "Oh yeah, I'm thinking about that," or "We'll see how it goes." I asked him directly if he had savings, if he'd made a budget. He told me no, but not to worry, that they'd be fine. I asked him about his first marriage, why it ended. He told me it just didn't work out, that they got married too young, he was like 22 at the time, that they didn't know each other well. I couldn't believe it. He was basically describing exactly what was going to happen with Natalie, and he didn't see it. I told him, "Look, Derek, I appreciate that you want to be with my daughter, but I think you're rushing this. Why don't you wait a year, get to know each other better, save money, maybe you finish high school?" Derek got defensive, told me he didn't need a diploma to be a good husband, that I didn't understand his relationship with Natalie. Natalie was there and started defending him, telling me I was a snob, that not everyone needs a college education to be valuable. I never said that, but she was determined to misinterpret everything I said. After that conversation, things got tense in the house. Natalie barely talked to me, spent all her time with Derek. I tried to talk to my mother, to some friends, asking them if I was being unreasonable. I told me the same thing, that I was right to be worried, but that Natalie was of legal age, and I couldn't stop her. My mother, Beatrice, even tried to talk to Natalie. She took her to lunch and told her, "Girl, you're making a huge mistake. But if you won't listen to me, at least listen to your father who only wants what's best for you." Natalie told her she was tired of everyone treating her like a child. A month before the wedding, Natalie came and told me I wasn't invited. Just like that. She showed up and said, "Dad, I've decided I don't want you to come to the wedding because you don't support my marriage, and I don't want negative energy on my special day." I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. I said, "Natalie, I'm your father. I've been here for you your whole life, and you're going to ban me from your wedding because I care about you?" She said yes, that was her decision. I asked her if her mother was going to be there. She told me, yes, that Catherine had said she supported her, completely. Of course she did. After that conversation, I made a difficult decision. Natalie had a credit card that I'd given her for emergencies, with a limit of like $2,000. I froze it. I knew she was probably planning to use it for the wedding, and I wasn't going to finance something I considered a massive mistake. When Natalie realized, she called me furious. She screamed at me on the phone, told me I was manipulative, that I was trying to control her life. I explained that I wasn't going to pay for a wedding. I wasn't even invited to. For a marriage I thought was rushed. She hung up. Turns out Natalie and Derek took out a loan for the wedding. A loan. Can you believe it? Two people with no stable jobs, no savings, borrowed thousands of dollars to throw a one-day party. When I found out, I wanted to die, but I couldn't do anything anymore. The wedding took place on a Saturday in July. I stayed home, alone, knowing my daughter was getting married without me there. My mother went, even though she didn't agree with the wedding either, because she said someone from my side of the family had to be there for Natalie. She told me later it was a small wedding, like 50 people, in a cheap hall with simple decorations. Catherine was there with her whole new family. Derek also invited his ex-wife, which my mother said was super weird. But the first few months after the wedding, I didn't hear anything from Natalie. Zero communication. I tried texting her a few times, asking how she was, but she ignored me. According to my mother, who did talk to her occasionally, Natalie and Derek had rented a small apartment and were trying to get established. My neighbor Jessica, who happened to be friends with Derek's sister, kept me updated without me asking. She'd tell me things like, "Oh, I heard Natalie and Derek are having trouble with bills," or "I think Derek lost one of his part-time jobs he'd gotten." About 4 months after the wedding, Derek showed up at my house. It was a Tuesday afternoon. I was working in my home office, and I heard the doorbell. When I opened the door, there was Derek, looking nervous, and he told me he needed to talk to me. I let him in, offered him water, and we sat in the living room. He explained they were having financial problems, that the apartment was more expensive than they thought, that the wedding loan payments were drowning them, that they needed help. He asked if I could lend them money, like $5,000. I told him no. Not cruelly, but firmly. I explained that I had warned about exactly this situation, that now they had to find a way to solve it themselves. I suggested he look for a second job, that Natalie get employment, that they talk to his parents. Derek told me his parents had already helped them a little but couldn't anymore. I told him I was sorry, but my answer was no. Derek left, clearly upset. That night, Natalie called me. I hadn't heard her voice in months, and the first time she talked to me was to yell at me. She told me I was a horrible father, that how could I let her and her husband sink, that I had money and didn't want to help out of pure spite. I told her, "Natalie, this isn't spite. This is letting you face the consequences of your decisions." I reminded her that I had warned her, that she had banned me from her wedding, that she had cut me out of her life. I told her that if she wanted my help, she needed to acknowledge she had made a mistake by rushing. Natalie said she would never admit that because it wasn't true, that Derek was the love of her life. She hung up again. 2 months later, Natalie called me crying. She told me she needed to see me, that it was urgent. My heart raced. I thought something terrible had happened. I told her to come to the house immediately. When she arrived, she was a mess, crying uncontrollably. She told me she thought she was pregnant. I felt the world stop. I asked her if she'd taken a test. She told me she'd taken 2 and both came out positive. I asked her what she wanted to do. She told me she didn't know, that she was scared, that Derek was excited but she didn't feel ready to be a mother, that they could barely support themselves. I was there for her that day. I hugged her, told her we were going to figure this out together. We made an appointment with a doctor to confirm the pregnancy, and it turned out to be a false alarm. The home tests had come out positive for some reason. Apparently it happens sometimes, but the blood test came out negative. Natalie felt relieved, and so did I, honestly. I thought maybe this scare would make her reflect on her situation, but as soon as it was confirmed she wasn't pregnant, Natalie distanced herself again. A couple more months passed, and Natalie called me again. This time, she asked if I could give Derek a job at my agency. I asked her what position exactly she thought Derek could work in. She said whatever, that Derek was very hardworking and could learn. I explained that my agency is creative. We work in graphic design, digital marketing, content. We didn't have positions for someone without education and without experience in the field. Natalie accused me of lying. Told me she knew I had open positions because she'd seen it on LinkedIn. I explained that yes, but they were for designers with portfolios and experience. She said, I was just looking for excuses not to help them. I told her that if Derek wanted to work with me, he needed to take courses, build a portfolio, show interest in the field. Natalie said that would take years, and they needed money now. She hung up, upset again. Then Catherine, my ex-wife who hadn't had a meaningful conversation with Natalie in years, called me. She yelled at me. Told me I was a bad father, that how could I abandon our daughter in her time of need. I reminded her that she'd been absent for years, that she had no right to lecture me about parenting. I told her that Natalie was an adult who had made decisions against my advice and now had to live with the consequences. Catherine told me I was cruel, that I was punishing Natalie. I told her I wasn't punishing her. I was letting her grow up. Catherine said she was going to help Natalie herself, but we both knew it was a lie. Catherine could barely handle her 3 young kids. About 6 months after the wedding, Natalie and Derek had to leave their apartment. They couldn't pay rent and the wedding loan at the same time. They moved into Derek's parents' basement. Yeah, the basement. Derek's parents, who by the way had also been against the marriage from the beginning, let them stay there without charging rent, but the condition was that they both had to work and save. My mother told me that Derek's parents weren't happy with the situation, that they'd hoped their son would mature after his first divorce, but that he'd basically gotten into the same situation again. Things between Natalie and Derek started to deteriorate. Jessica, my neighbor, told me that a sister-in-law had told her that Natalie and Derek fought constantly, that Derek spent all his time playing video games in the basement instead of looking for better jobs, that Natalie had gotten a part-time job at a retail store but hated every minute of it, that Derek's parents were getting tired of having them there, that Natalie had mentioned several times that maybe her father had been right. It was like a month ago that Natalie finally contacted me again. It wasn't exactly an apology, but she asked if we could meet for coffee. I agreed. We met at a Starbucks near my house, and when I saw her, I realized how much she'd changed. She looked tired, thinner, older. She told me things with Derek weren't good, that she realized they'd made a mistake getting married so quickly. She didn't explicitly say I was right, but it was implied. She told me they were considering selling some of their things to finish paying off the wedding loan, that Derek had finally admitted he needed to get a better job but didn't know how. She asked me, without asking directly, if I had any advice. I told her that if Derek really wanted to change his situation, he needed to invest in education or training, that there were community programs, online courses, certifications he could get without spending a fortune, that it wasn't too late to finish his high school. There are programs for adults, that she should also consider finishing hers. Natalie told me she was tired of hearing about education, but then went quiet and admitted I was probably right. I asked her if she was happy. Her eyes filled with tears and she said she didn't know, that she loved Derek but the life they had wasn't what she'd imagined. I didn't give her money that day, but I gave her something I hope is more valuable. I told her that my door had always been open for her, that I never stopped being her father, that if she needed real help, not money but emotional support, guidance, I was there. I told her that if I wanted to go back to school, I would pay for that. That if she wanted therapy, I would pay for that too. But that I wasn't going to finance bad decisions or rescue her from the consequences of her actions. Natalie nodded, didn't say much more. Since then, we've talked a couple more times. The conversations are still awkward. There's a lot left unsaid, a lot of pain on both sides. Natalie still hasn't given me a real apology for banning me from her wedding or for the horrible things she said to me. I haven't pushed for one either. I'm just trying to be available without being a lifeline. You know what I mean? It's the hardest line I've ever had to walk as a father. Derek and Natalie are still together, still living in his parents' basement. My mother tells me Natalie has mentioned she might look for full-time work, that Derek finally enrolled in a program to finish high school online. They're small steps, I guess. I don't know if they'll stay together long-term. Honestly, I think they'll probably end up divorcing in a couple years, but that's their decision to make, not mine. What keeps me up at night isn't whether I was right or not, because I know I was. What keeps me up at night is wondering if I could have handled things differently, if maybe I was too hard, if I should have been at that wedding despite everything. My mother tells me I did the right thing, that Natalie needed to face reality, that if I had rescued her, I would have only postponed the inevitable, and probably made things worse. My friends tell me the same thing. But a father's heart doesn't work on logic, it works on love. And sometimes love hurts more than anything else. Last week, Natalie sent me a message that said, "Thanks for the coffee. Dad, we can do it again soon." It's not much, very little after everything that happened, but it's something. I replied, "Sure, whenever you want." And there it is. That's my life now. Waiting for my 20-year-old daughter, married, living in a basement, working retail, to learn the lessons I tried to teach her 2 years ago. I just hope that when she's finally ready to really talk, to acknowledge what happened, I still have enough patience and love to be there. Because at the end of the day, she's still my daughter, and there's nothing that can change that, no matter how many bad decisions she makes.